The morning was calm and gentle, as if the sky itself had decided to grant us a few extra hours of peace. I sat at the table in our bright kitchen, savoring the aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Richard was reading the news on his tablet, his focused face resembling a statue of confidence and composure. Every day he followed the same ritual, brushing my hand lightly, scanning the headlines, and occasionally making remarks about company affairs. It felt like we were the perfect couple, our sturdy home, stable life, and cozy atmosphere. Yet, despite it all, I couldn't shake the feeling of something unresolved smoldering within me, like a forgotten candle flickering in a corner of the room. "Zach's arriving tonight," Richard said, glancing at me over his tablet. "It's high time he finished that damn degree and started taking life seriously." I smiled, trying to conceal my unease. Zach, I hadn't seen him in nearly 3 years. He had been a teenager when he left, but his energy had always filled the house. His absence created a space where Richard and I could live peacefully, free from unnecessary disruptions. Yet the thought of his return suddenly stirred something unfamiliar within me, anticipation and a touch of nervousness. That evening, when I opened the door and saw Zach standing on the threshold, I was momentarily speechless. His arrival felt like a scene from a movie. Bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun, he stood with a slight smirk on his lips, his gaze calm yet bold. It was clear he had grown, not just physically. His movements, posture, even the way he spoke, all of it spoke of maturity, and, to my dismay, I found it captivating. "Jessica," he said, extending his hand as though we were at a formal meeting. His voice was low and confident, nothing like the awkward tone I remembered. "It's good to be back. You look stunning." "Zach, stop it," I replied with a smile, feeling a faint blush creep onto my cheeks. "Come in, everyone's waiting for you." The atmosphere at dinner was peculiar. Zach sat across from Richard and never missed an opportunity to make a pointed remark. His words carried a tone as though he were testing the limits of his father's patience, probing an invisible wall. "You're always about business, Dad. I wonder, do you even know they discussed recipes on the radio today?" he said with a smirk, raising his wine glass. "Unlike you, Zach, I prefer productivity over idle chatter," Richard replied, not lifting his gaze from his plate. I hurried to change the subject, hoping to diffuse the tension and salvage the evening. Yet I noticed the way Zach glanced at me, assessing, almost studying. It was unsettling, as though he was trying to understand me anew. That look sent a faint shiver down my spine. When dinner ended, Richard retreated to his study, leaving Zach and me alone in the living room. He threw himself onto the couch, arms casually folded behind his head. "3 years, and nothing here has changed," he said lazily, staring at the ceiling. "Not even you, Jessica. You still look perfect." His words might have been a simple compliment, but they stirred something in me. His tone was too nonchalant, yet it carried an undertone I couldn't ignore. "This is your home, Zach. We tried to keep everything just as you like it," I replied, striving to maintain my usual lightheartedness. "Thanks for that," he said, turning his head toward me with a faint smile. "I think I'll be staying here longer than I planned." His words sounded like a promise. I didn't know why they left me unsettled, but their echo lingered long after Zach had gone upstairs. That night, I couldn't sleep. The familiar, comforting sounds of the house felt strangely alien. It seemed as though a new chapter of our lives had begun, but I couldn't grasp where it was leading us. The house was still asleep. Thin rays of light filtered through the blinds in the living room, filling the space with a soft morning glow. I cherished these hours when silence felt almost tangible, and the air carried a fresh and tranquil energy. My fingers curled around a teacup, savoring its warmth. The gentle rustle of leaves outside was the only sound until light footsteps broke the quiet. "Early riser, just like me," Zach's voice cut through the stillness. He stood in the doorway, slightly disheveled, barefoot, with a faint smile on his face. Do you always wake up this early? This is my time, I replied with a smile, taking a sip of tea. And you? Couldn't sleep? Getting used to a new routine? He shrugged and settled into the chair across from me. His movements were relaxed, but his gaze was sharp, focused, studying me openly. You look good, I said, trying to steer the conversation elsewhere. It seems time away from home has done you well. Zach smirked, his smile laced with light irony. Is that a compliment? Or are you just surprised I didn't fall apart after 3 years? A compliment, I replied, a hint of playful warmth creeping into my tone. Don't read too much into it. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Then let me be direct. You look stunning, too. Honestly, I'm surprised Richard hasn't gone blind from your beauty yet. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. His remark was unexpectedly bold, even brazen. I felt a flush rise to my cheeks. Zach, I managed to say at last, striving for a light-hearted tone. You're too young to be saying things like that. Too young? He laughed, but his eyes didn't share the mirth. I'm not a boy anymore, Jessica. Maybe you just haven't noticed. His words hung in the air, leaving me momentarily speechless. I lowered my gaze, sensing the delicate line between jest and something deeper beginning to blur. Before I could respond, he stood up. All right, I won't keep you. See you later, he said casually, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. After my morning yoga, I felt a sense of calm, though my earlier conversation with Zach lingered in my mind. His words, his confidence, it all felt strange, almost forbidden. I entered the house and headed to the bathroom. The soft fabric of my workout clothes clung to my body as I tried to organize my thoughts. When I opened the bathroom door, not expecting anyone to be inside, I froze. Zach was standing by the mirror, adjusting his shirt. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and the space around us shrank to the confines of the small room. Sorry, I didn't know you were here, I said, taking a step back. Don't leave, he said softly but firmly. Just a minute. His gaze swept over me, and I felt exposed, as though standing under a spotlight. I knew I shouldn't react, but every fiber of my being was on edge. Jessica, he said my name slowly, as if savoring it. You know I admire you, don't you? I wanted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He stepped closer, closing the gap between us. My hand still gripped the doorknob, but I didn't move. When his face drew near, I felt the warmth of his breath. Zach, this isn't, I began, but he cut me off by brushing his lips against mine. It was quick, yet far too long. In that moment, the world seemed to fade, leaving just the two of us. I pulled away, shocked by my own reaction. My heart pounded loudly, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. You're out of your mind, I whispered, struggling to regain control. Maybe, he said with a faint smile, stepping back, but I don't regret it. Without a word, I turned and left, leaving him alone. A strange heat still burned in my chest, and his words echoed in my mind. I knew it was wrong, everything about it was wrong, but why did I feel like I wanted more? Zach spent more time at home than I had anticipated. His presence became almost routine, and he seamlessly blended into the rhythm of our lives. In the mornings, he sat at the table with a cup of coffee, discussing some abstract topic with Richard, and in the evenings, he helped me clear the dishes after dinner. His ease, his smile, all of it filled the house with an energy that both irritated and mesmerized me. One afternoon, while Richard was at a meeting, Zach offered to help me in the garden. It was a hot day, and I had thrown on a light cotton shirt and shorts without thinking much about it. Zach was already outside waiting for me, holding gardening tools. Do you know what to do with that? I asked with a slight smile, nodding toward the rake in his hands. I'm a jack of all trades, he smirked, winking. Just tell me where to dig. We worked side by side, and every one of his remarks carried a subtle undertone of provocation. When I crouched to adjust the flower beds, he gave in and laughed. You know, this isn't fair. You're in those shorts, and I'm supposed to focus on work. I felt my cheeks flush. Zach, don't be childish. I tried to sound stern, but my voice wavered. Don't worry, I'm just joking, he said. But there was a note in his voice that made the joke feel more personal. These little moments started happening more often. His light touches, the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long, everything felt like playing with fire. Each time, I convinced myself I could control the situation, but something inside me was growing, making my heart race every time he was near. My thoughts became tangled. I loved Richard. It was an honest love, built on years of shared life. But our life was so predictable that I sometimes felt as if I were living on autopilot. Zach had become a spark I feared yet couldn't ignore. His laughter, his confidence, his boldness, they all made me feel younger, more alive. Sometimes I caught myself looking for excuses to be near him. One such moment happened in the evening while I was washing dishes. He came into the kitchen, stepping closer than necessary as he took a glass from my hands. His fingers brushed mine, almost imperceptibly. I froze but didn't pull away. You're too tense, Jessica, he said with a grin. Relax. Easy for you to say, I replied, avoiding his gaze. His eyes burned into my back as I finished my chores. But these moments didn't go unnoticed. Richard began to see that I was lost in my thoughts too often. He was a caring husband, but his confidence in the stability of our marriage blinded him. One evening, as we sat on the couch, he placed a hand on my shoulder and gently asked, Are you okay? You've seemed distant these past few days. I flinched at his words, though he spoke with tenderness. I'm fine, just a little tired, I lied, avoiding his eyes. If something's wrong, tell me. I'm here, Jessica. His voice was sincere, but suddenly it became hard to breathe, as if he was trying to reach a place I didn't want him to see. I nodded, but I felt the first crack in our life together. It wasn't just tension, it was the cry of an inner conflict I could no longer ignore. That night, I lay awake, listening to Richard's breathing. His arms wrapped around me, yet it felt as if an invisible chasm separated us. Zach was in my head. His words, his touch. I couldn't understand why I wanted something I wasn't supposed to want so badly. But one thing was clear. This struggle within me was becoming harder to bear. Richard left early in the morning, bidding a hasty goodbye as he usually did when heading off on another business trip. His suitcase had stood by the door all evening, and it seemed he hadn't even noticed my absence at dinner. I spent that night alone, caught in the web of my own confusion. The next morning, when Zach came into the kitchen, his request surprised me. Can you give me a ride? I need to go to the next town to meet some friends, and Dad took my car, he said, looking at me with a faint smile. I hesitated, but not for long. All right, just be ready in half an hour, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We drove along an empty road, the endless stretch of fields, and the occasional passing car creating a strange sense of isolation. Zach sat relaxed, one hand on the door handle, the other drumming his fingers on his knee in time with the radio's rhythm. Don't you get bored driving me around so often? He asked suddenly, turning his head toward me. Why would you think that? I glanced at him from the corner of my eye, focusing on the road. Just feels like I'm always interfering in your life, he said with a smirk, though there was something deeper in his voice. Or maybe you like spending time with me? My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. His words were always on the edge, like a riddle that could mean everything or nothing. We drove a few more miles, when an odd noise came from under the hood. I pulled over to the side of the road and got out, hoping it was something minor. Zach stepped out too, glancing around. Looks like we've got a problem, he said, leaning over the hood. I pulled out my phone, but the signal was weak. The nearest motel was miles away, and help wouldn't arrive anytime soon. So what now? Do we wait? He climbed back into the car, leaving the door open to let in the cool breeze. We sat in silence until he spoke again. Have you ever wondered why Dad is so emotionally distant? His voice was soft, but there was bitterness underneath. Richard isn't emotionally distant. He's just, I faltered, struggling to find the right words. He's focused. It's his way of showing he cares. Zach scoffed. Cares? He cares about his work, not the people around him. You know that. You live with him. You feel it every day. His words hit harder than I expected. I wanted to argue, but I realized there was some truth in them. Richard was a good husband, but sometimes it felt like I was just another stable piece in his well-ordered life. What about you? I asked, deflecting. Why are you so determined to prove something to him? Zach looked at me intently, his eyes serious. Because he's never seen me as anything more than his reflection, and I want to be more. And you know what? He paused. You're one of the few people who sees me as more. His words caught me off guard. My heart began to race as Zach leaned slightly closer, his gaze revealing more than I was ready to acknowledge. By evening, we reached a small motel to spend the night while waiting for help. The room was cramped, and the tension between us grew with every passing minute. I avoided looking at him, focusing on small tasks, making the bed, unpacking, checking my phone, but his presence was undeniable. Jessica, his voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Why are you so afraid to be yourself around me? What are you talking about? I looked at him, trying to maintain composure. I'm talking about how you pretend everything's under control, but I see you. I see the real you, and you know it, he said, taking a step closer. Zach, we can't, I began, but he interrupted, his hand brushing mine. Why? Because you're more afraid of yourself than you are of me? His words echoed in my mind. He was too close. I wanted to stop this, but I couldn't. In that moment, he leaned in and kissed me. The kiss was longer than the first and far more intense. It carried an energy that overwhelmed me completely. I pulled away, feeling my thoughts spiral into chaos. We can't, Zach, I whispered, retreating toward the door. But you want this. His voice was firm. And I know you do. I said nothing. I closed my eyes, trembling as a wave of emotions washed over me. The next morning, the sun had barely risen above the horizon when I was already up. A strange sensation weighed in my chest, a mix of guilt and embarrassment. The events of the previous night at the motel wouldn't leave my mind. I kept trying to find justification for my actions, but every time I failed. Richard came home shortly after noon. He looked tired, but just as composed and confident as always. I met him at the door with a smile, deliberately ignoring the turmoil inside me. How was the trip? I asked, taking his coat. As usual. Exhausting but productive, he replied, giving me a quick kiss on the cheek before heading to the living room. Sitting next to him, I realized how much I wanted to bring our marriage back to what it used to be. Zach was like a fire, burning me from the inside. But Richard was my safe harbor, the stability that now felt like salvation. I decided to arrange a romantic dinner to strengthen our bond and remind myself why I had chosen this man. In the evening, I set the table, prepared his favorite dishes, and lit candles. I chose a dress he always called stunning, and spent more time in front of the mirror than usual. When Richard entered the dining room, his gaze was approving. What's the special occasion? He asked, sitting down at the table. I just wanted us to have an evening together, I smiled, trying to sound casual. We rarely spend time like this. Richard raised his wineglass, his eyes warm but scrutinizing. This is a wonderful idea, Jess. Sometimes I feel like I forget how important these moments are. The dinner was going well, but I felt tense. Every question he asked about my day, about how I spent my time in his absence, resonated within me. His voice was calm, but there was something unsettling about it. You've been looking thoughtful lately, he noted, setting his fork down. Is everything all right? Yes, of course, I replied quickly, lowering my gaze. Just a little tired. He leaned back in his chair, watching me closely. Jessica, if something's wrong, you can tell me. We've always been honest with each other. His words pierced me. At that moment, I felt like a terrible wife, as if I had betrayed not just him, but myself as well. Everything's fine, Richard. Really? I answered, trying to sound sincere. But his gaze lingered on me, as if he could sense that something had come between us, something he couldn't understand. Zach avoided me all day. Usually, he found excuses to be nearby, but now it was as if he had vanished into the walls of the house. I found him in the garden later in the evening. He was sitting on a wooden bench, staring into the distance, as though he wanted to leave not just the house, but my life. Decided to become invisible? I asked, sitting down beside him. He turned to me, and his eyes held a mix of sadness and resolve. Jessica, I can see how this is tearing you apart. His voice was soft, almost tender. This isn't what I want. Zach, I began, but he raised a hand to stop me. Listen, I can't just sit here and watch you struggle with yourself because of me. You deserve better. I thought I could handle this, but I guess I was wrong. I felt my heart clench. His words, his gaze, they all showed that he genuinely cared about me, but he also understood that our feelings only made things more complicated. Do you think leaving will fix everything? I asked, unable to hold back my tears. I don't know, but I have to try, he said, standing up and placing a hand on my shoulder. Maybe it's the right thing to do. I was left alone on the bench, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading away. His words left an emptiness inside me, but I knew he was right. We had gone too far, and every new step only deepened my guilt. That night, I lay beside Richard, feeling the silence between us grow. He was there, but I knew our connection was fracturing. I closed my eyes, deciding I would fight for our marriage, even if it meant silencing my feelings for Zach. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be easy. The evening began as an ordinary family event. Richard insisted on having dinner to celebrate his return and invited Zach to join us. I wasn't ready to see him again after he had decided to distance himself, but I couldn't voice my hesitation. When Zach entered the dining room, his effortless smile lit up the room. He joked and shared stories, sitting directly across from me, but I felt his gaze on me even when he wasn't looking my way. I had chosen a fitted skirt and blouse without much thought, but his eyes lingered on me for a moment, and I caught something new in his expression, something almost admiring. It sent a strange thrill coursing through me. After dinner, I began clearing the dishes. Richard had retreated to his office to discuss business with a partner, leaving Zach and me alone in the dining room. As I bent to pick up a fallen napkin, I felt his gaze on me. When I straightened, our eyes met, and his face tightened. He quickly looked away, but the moment spoke volumes. Zach left the room abruptly, muttering, "I'll be right back," and the tension in the air became almost tangible. His reaction made me question everything. Was I doing something wrong? Or perhaps too right? When I stepped into the guest bedroom to collect myself, the door closed softly behind me. I turned to see Zach standing there. His face was a mix of determination and hesitation, his hands trembling as if he was wrestling with himself. Zach, what are you doing? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to talk, he began, stepping closer. You don't even realize how beautiful you are, do you? His words hit me like a blow to the chest. I tried to step back, but I couldn't move. His eyes held mine, and his voice carried a sincerity that made me forget everything else. Zach, this is wrong. I started, but he cut me off. Wrong? Then what's right? Pretending nothing's happening? Pretending I feel nothing for you? His voice grew louder, almost desperate. Do you think this is easy for me? I couldn't answer. His words resonated within me, shattering the last remnants of my resolve. He stepped closer, and I felt the warmth of his presence. I know you're scared, he whispered, but I see the real you. He leaned in, and our lips met. It wasn't just a kiss. It was passion, emotion, everything I had tried to suppress over these days. His hands brushed over my shoulders, and I felt the ground beneath me disappear. I couldn't resist. I didn't want to resist. But suddenly, the door swung open. Richard stood in the doorway. His face showed confusion, but not rage. He noticed how close we were standing, but perhaps he didn't yet understand what was happening. "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm but icy. I quickly stepped back, trying to steady my breathing. I I just wanted to check if everything was all right with the guest room, I stammered, avoiding his gaze. "Zach, were you looking for something?" Richard's eyes narrowed slightly as he turned to his son. "Yeah, I came to grab a charger," Zach replied smoothly, his voice calm, as if nothing had happened. Richard nodded, but his gaze lingered on me. I felt him assessing, noticing details, trying to piece together what he had walked in on. Finally, he turned and left, leaving the two of us alone. Zach looked at me, his face tense. "Are you okay?" he whispered. "No, I'm not okay," I said, turning away as tears welled in my eyes. "This has gone too far, Zach." He didn't reply. He simply nodded and left the room. The taste of his kiss lingered in the air, and I knew this was the beginning of the end, for us and for my marriage. The morning after that tense evening was unusually quiet. The house felt empty, even though Richard was somewhere downstairs, busy with his work. I could feel the silence wrapping around me, almost pressing down on me. Everything that had happened in the guest bedroom felt like a dream, but the bitter taste of reality was too sharp for it to be a lie. When I went down to the kitchen, Zach wasn't there. Usually, I could find him with a cup of coffee or lingering near the refrigerator, but today, it was as if he had vanished. It seemed odd, but I chose not to dwell on it, assuming he had simply gone out for a walk. However, as I passed by his room, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Inside, everything was tidy, the bed neatly made. On the desk lay a note, and my heart clenched when I saw my name written in Zach's steady handwriting. I picked it up slowly, my fingers trembling. "Jessica, I'm leaving because I don't want to ruin your life. I see how hard this is for you, and I can't bear to be the cause of your pain any longer. But I want you to know this. You've changed me. I'll never be able to forget you, but now I have to leave to give you the chance to be happy. Zach." I read those lines several times, feeling everything inside me twist. He was gone, and perhaps it was for the best. But why did it hurt so much? Why did it feel like something vital had been ripped from my life? Richard was in his office when I walked in. He looked up as he noticed me and smiled, but there was something in his gaze that I couldn't decipher. "Good morning," he said, setting aside his papers. "You look tired. Is everything all right?" "Yes, I'm fine. Just didn't sleep well," I replied, sitting across from him. I decided to try to reconnect with him, to give myself a chance to mend our marriage. I started talking about trivial things, plans for the day, household matters. But my thoughts kept drifting back to Zach's note. His words echoed in my mind, making it impossible to focus. Richard listened intently, but I could sense he was noticing something. His gaze was too probing, too scrutinizing. "You seem a bit distracted, Jess. Are you sure everything's all right?" He leaned forward, his tone gentle yet persistent. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. I wanted to be honest, but how could I tell the truth when it might shatter everything we'd built together? "Just a lot on my mind," I finally answered, avoiding his eyes. "Jessica," he said my name as though he wanted to reach the very core of my being. "If something's going on, I want to know. I can feel you're hiding something." His words made me freeze. It was the moment I realized our bond was already fracturing. He was beginning to suspect, but didn't want to believe it. His confidence in our stability was starting to crumble. I spent the rest of the day in a strange state of apathy. I tried to focus on tasks, but my thoughts kept returning to Zach. I couldn't get his gaze, his voice, his farewell words out of my head. Richard, on the other hand, was suspiciously quiet. He avoided direct questions, but lingered longer than usual in rooms I entered. His gaze became more observant, as if he were searching for subtle signs no one else would notice. In the evening, as I stood by the window, watching the sunset, Richard approached me from behind. He wrapped his arms around my shoulders, but his touch felt foreign. "Jessica," he said softly, "you know I love you, right?" "Yes, I know," I replied, but my words sounded too mechanical. He turned me to face him, looking straight into my eyes. "Then tell me what's going on. I can't shake the feeling that something has changed. I don't understand it, but I can feel it." I didn't know how to respond. My heart screamed at me to tell the truth, but my mind begged me to remain silent. I just stood there, unable to find the words. Richard slowly let go of me and nodded, as if taking my silence as an answer. "All right," he said, walking out of the room. But his voice was cold, and I knew that silent, "all right," marked the beginning of something I could no longer control. Several days had passed since Zach left. Time dragged on like thick molasses, each morning beginning with the heavy weight of loss. Richard continued to watch me, his suspicions growing more evident with each passing day, but I worked hard to maintain an appearance of normalcy. That day, I decided to go into town to shop. The outing was supposed to distract me, to give me a chance to regain control over my thoughts, but everything changed when I saw him. Zach was standing at the entrance of a small cafe, holding a cup of coffee, the same defiant smile on his face. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted, growing serious. "Jessica," he said, stepping closer as if afraid I might disappear. "Zach, what are you doing here?" I asked, trying to hide my confusion. "Can I ask you the same question?" He smirked, though his voice held genuine warmth. "You look like you'd rather not be disturbed." I sighed, realizing there was no use resisting. "It's been a tough day," I said. "Let me make it better," he offered, his voice quiet but steady. "Talk to me? Just you and me." I wanted to refuse, but my legs had already taken a step toward him. We entered the small cafe, choosing the most secluded corner to ensure no one would bother us. At first, the conversation was cautious, as though we were both afraid of upsetting the fragile balance between us. But gradually, the walls between us began to crumble. "Why did you leave?" I asked, when the conversation turned more personal. Zach looked at me for a long moment, then lowered his eyes. "Because I didn't want to ruin your life. You deserve better than me. And honestly, I thought I could forget you." "But you're here," I said, my voice trembling. "I can't forget you, Jessica. I tried, but you're in me. Every look, every word. It's more than just desire. I love you." His words struck me like lightning. I had known he felt something for me, but this confession, it upended everything. "Zach, you can't. We can't," I began, but he interrupted me. "I don't want to be just a distraction for you. I don't want you to see me as something temporary. You're everything I want. And I know it's wrong, but it's the truth." Tears welled up in my eyes. His words stirred something deeply buried within me. I knew this had to end, but for some reason, I couldn't let him go. We spent hours together, walking through the city. It was a strange evening, a mix of pain, joy, and inevitability. I knew I would return home feeling guilty, but I couldn't stop myself. When I got back, Richard was waiting for me in the living room. His face looked tired, but his eyes were sharp, like a predator's. "You're late," he said, his gaze studying me. "I just got held up in town. Had to pick up a few things," I replied, trying to sound calm. "Really?" He stood, his stare piercing. "You look different, like something happened." I froze, feeling panic rise within me. His words were like a blow to my back, but I tried to hold my composure. "Richard, I'm just tired," I said, brushing past him to avoid meeting his eyes. "Jessica." His voice was firm, almost icy. "If you're hiding something, I want to know. Now." I stopped but didn't turn around. The words stuck in my throat. I knew he suspected, but he wasn't certain yet. It was a race against time, and I didn't know how long I could keep up the facade. "Nothing is happening," I finally said, but my voice was too soft to convince even myself. I went upstairs, feeling his gaze burning into my back. That night, I couldn't sleep, listening to the ticking of the clock in the living room. Zach had returned to my life, and now I stood on the edge of a precipice, unsure if I could pull back. The morning began with an oppressive silence. I could feel how the quietness of the house grew heavier, each passing hour drawing closer to the moment when everything would inevitably come to light. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his gaze gliding over the screen of his tablet, but I could tell he wasn't reading. He was waiting for the moment to say what had been troubling him. "We need to talk," he finally said, without lifting his head. My heart stopped. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of steel. "Of course," I replied, trying to appear calm, though everything inside me was trembling. He set the tablet aside and looked at me, his gaze almost piercing. "I want to know the truth, Jessica. What's going on? You've changed. You're not the person you used to be." "Nothing's going on, Richard." I tried to smile, but I felt my lips quiver. "I've just been lost in my thoughts." "Thoughts about what?" His voice grew firmer. "You're not even trying to convince me everything's fine. I can see you slipping away from me, becoming someone else." My breathing quickened, and I averted my gaze. "You're imagining things," I whispered, but even I knew it sounded unconvincing. "Imagining things." He stood up from the table, his figure seeming larger than usual. "Look me in the eye, Jessica. Are you involved with someone else?" His words hit me harder than I had expected. I couldn't admit it, but denying it felt pointless. Silence hung between us, like an invisible chasm into which we could both fall. When Zach returned home, I felt the tension reach its breaking point. He entered, trying to appear composed, but his eyes betrayed that he had come for a reason. Richard was in the living room, and as soon as he saw his son, he tensed. "So, you decided to come back?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you have a reason for this." Zach stepped closer, his posture firm and his gaze unwavering. "We need to talk," he said, looking directly at his father. "About what?" Richard raised an eyebrow. "About how you disappeared without a word? Or is this another one of your demands?" Zach glanced briefly at me before turning back to Richard. "No, father. I want to talk about Jessica." My heart skipped a beat. I felt my legs weaken, and I had to lean against the back of the couch to keep from collapsing. "What are you trying to say?" Richard asked, his voice dropping, now laced with a threatening edge. "You don't see how much she's suffering," Zach said, his voice steady but filled with genuine concern. "You think you know her, but you have no idea what's going on inside her." Richard rose to his feet, his face hardening. "Are you accusing me of something, son? Or are you just trying to justify your own words?" "This isn't about you, father." Zach took a step back. "It's about her. She deserves more than just being your possession." Those words brought fury to Richard's eyes. He stepped forward, but I moved between them, feeling my nerves stretched to their limit. "Stop it!" I shouted, trying to hold them back. "Neither of you understands what you're doing." They fell silent, but the tension in the room was so thick it was almost tangible. That night, I was left alone in my room. Richard retreated to his study, and Zach left the house, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat on the bed, my head in my hands, feeling torn between the two men who had become everything to me. Richard was my safety, my home, but Zach was the fire that ignited something within me. I realized I couldn't go on like this. It was a moment of truth, a moment where I had to make a choice. But no matter what choice I made, I knew it would destroy something precious. My heart ached from letting things go this far, and I couldn't figure out how to find my way back. The house was enveloped in an eerie silence. The air felt charged with tension, as though the very walls understood that something inevitable was approaching. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, but its taste was bitter, despite the sugar I had added. Richard was in the living room, flipping through some documents, his movements nervous and abrupt. Zach had disappeared again, and this time, I sensed it could be for good. At some point, I heard the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Richard moved down the hallway, but not toward his study. He was heading to Zach's room. His intent was clear. He wasn't going to leave his questions unanswered. I stayed in the kitchen, too afraid to follow. Every second of waiting felt interminable. Then I heard the sound of a drawer opening. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum. I knew he would find the note Zach had left for me. I had never thought to destroy it. It held the truth, even if it had the power to unravel everything. Moments later, Richard came downstairs. In his hand was that very note. He unfolded it slowly, as though he wanted to read not just the words, but the intent behind them. His eyes scanned the lines, and with each new phrase, his expression shifted. Anger, pain, confusion, all flickered in his gaze within seconds. I remained silent, too afraid to speak. Is it true? His voice was cold, almost emotionless. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. All I could do was nod. Tears filled my eyes and spilled down my cheeks. His face stayed motionless, but I could see something inside him crumbling. He didn't shout, didn't demand answers, didn't make any sudden moves. He just stood there, staring at me as if seeing the real me for the first time. He carefully folded the note and placed it on the table. Then, without a word, he turned and left the room. His footsteps were dull thuds as he climbed the stairs, leaving me in the suffocating silence. I didn't know what he would decide, but I knew that nothing would ever be the same. I stood and walked to the window. The night air was cold, and the street outside looked desolate. My thoughts spiraled, broken and chaotic. Zach. His words. His touch. I stared at the road, hoping he would appear as he had done before. But the road remained empty. I wrapped my arms around myself, trembling. Zach was gone. He had left me so I could make a choice, so I could try to bring my life back to what it once was. But was that even possible now? Could anything truly be restored after it had been shattered? At that moment, everything felt fragile, unreal. The house was no longer a refuge. Richard was somewhere upstairs, deciding how to move forward. Zach had vanished, leaving me alone with the silence. I stood there, as if life itself had placed me in front of a mirror, forcing me to confront what I had become. Outside, the wind swayed the trees, their shadows flickering across the glass. I stared into the emptiness, feeling myself slowly unravel. Perhaps I deserved this. Perhaps this was the price for those fleeting moments when I had allowed myself to forget reality. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know what Richard would choose. I didn't know if Zach would return. All I could do was stand by the window and watch the night swallow the city, hoping that dawn would bring even a sliver of an answer.